A woman left work, got in her car, and stopped answering messages. When police got involved, they could hardly find any evidence at all. But the case quickly started snowballing with new details. And once detectives finally uncovered the full story, they could barely process what they were looking at. It was hard to believe any of this had actually happened in real life. But it did, and the case quickly captured nationwide attention. Kendra Hatcher was born on February 3, 1980, in Springfield, Illinois. She grew up in a large, deeply religious family, and from the time she was little, church was a big part of her life. In school, Kendra didn't just get top grades. She also captained 2 teams, volleyball and cheerleading. On top of that, she spent a lot of her free time helping others. She led Bible classes for kids at her church and went on mission trips instead of spending summer breaks with her friends. After finishing high school near the top of her class, Kendra went on to a university in Indiana, where she studied biochemistry and Spanish. From there, she moved to Kentucky, graduated from dental school, and became a pediatric dentist. Kendra was determined to help children, no matter how much money their parents had, so she regularly treated kids in low-income neighborhoods completely free of charge. She also traveled to Ecuador to treat kids who had no access to dental care at all. In 2015, Kendra got a job offer as a pediatric dentist at a clinic in Dallas, so she moved to Texas and rented an apartment in an upscale complex. She was 35 at the time and had already built a successful career, but she also wanted a family. A few months later, she met a 38-year-old man online named Ricardo, and things between them took off quickly. Ricky was a Harvard-trained doctor working as a dermatologist with a solid career of his own. After just a few dates, Kendra and Ricky felt like they were made for each other. On top of both being in medicine, they shared the same values, the same interests, and the same big plans for the future. Kendra was always full of energy, and Ricky matched her pace. They spent the summer of 2015 practically inseparable, traveling together whenever they could. By August, they were already talking about marriage and had even set up a joint wedding fund to save for the ceremony of their dreams. Ricky was also planning to move to California that fall, and Kendra was going to go with him. Over the next few weeks, they were busy getting ready for the move. At the same time, they planned a trip to visit Kendra's parents and also booked a short vacation in Mexico. Their flights were set for September 3rd. The day before their trip, Ricky finished his shift a little after 4 p.m., grabbed his suitcase from home, and headed over to Kendra's apartment. She was still at work, and he planned to just wait for her there. Around 6 o'clock, he went out for an evening run and got back about an hour and a half later. He hadn't taken his phone with him, and when he returned, he saw that Kendra had sent 2 texts. At about 6:45, she'd written that her shift was finally over, and she was on her way home. 20 minutes later, she sent another message saying she decided to swing by a friend's place to borrow an underwater camera for their trip. Then, 5 minutes after Ricky got back from his run, she texted again that she was done with everything and was heading straight home. A little later, he texted her that he was starving and asked what she wanted for dinner, but she didn't reply. Figuring she just couldn't answer while driving, he wrote that he'd walk over to a nearby Mexican food truck and grab something for both of them. On his way back, Ricky noticed that the multi-level parking garage at Kendra's complex was crawling with police. Patrol cars were everywhere with their lights on, and the entrances and exits were taped off in yellow. He texted Kendra about it and told her to find somewhere else to park her car. But again, there was no response. He went back up to her apartment and waited a while longer, but Kendra still didn't come home. At that time, Ricky didn't panic at all. He assumed she might have remembered some last-minute errands before their trip and was just tied up. Eventually, he decided to drive back to his own place to grab a few more things for the road. When he returned to Kendra's building, he got into the elevator and pressed her floor. But a police officer standing inside immediately stopped him and said he couldn't go up. That's when it suddenly hit Ricky that Kendra's long silence might be connected to the police presence at her complex. And a short time later, officers confirmed his worst fear. Kendra had been found dead in the parking lot. According to officers, someone walked up to her just after she stepped out of her car and shot her in the back of the head at almost point-blank range. The killer took her purse and the underwater camera she'd just borrowed from her friend. At first, everything pointed to a robbery, Kendra lived in an upscale complex, and it was easy to imagine someone slipping into the multi-level garage, hoping to mug a resident. Maybe they hadn't planned to kill her, but she screamed or tried to run. The attacker panicked and pulled the trigger. But that theory started to fall apart almost immediately. You could only get into the garage with a passcode that only residents had. And the killer didn't even take her phone, even though it was sitting in plain sight. To detectives, it began to look much more like something personal, and Ricky was the first person they took a hard look at. The fact that he'd been in her apartment and went in and out around the time of the murder made them wonder if he was involved. But surveillance footage and witness statements eventually showed he hadn't been in the garage when the shooting happened. He also seemed genuinely shocked and devastated, enough that investigators began to doubt he had anything to do with it. Soon, officers found a witness who'd been in the garage at the time of the shooting. One of the residents had gotten down there in the elevator with a friend, and as soon as the doors opened, they heard a gunshot nearby, followed by a piercing scream. The two men panicked, ran to their car, and locked themselves inside. Moments later, an old black Jeep drove past them. They immediately assumed the driver had something to do with the gunshot because the Jeep was flying through the narrow garage at high speed, heading down as if the driver didn't realize it dead-ended below. A few seconds later, the Jeep came back up and turned the other way, toward the exit. The resident called 911 and drove outside. As he passed Kendra's car, he saw a woman's body lying next to it, in a pool of blood. Security cameras didn't cover the exact spot where the shooting happened, but detectives quickly found the black Jeep on other cameras. And that's where the first surprise came in. The driver was clearly a woman. That detail made the robbery theory look even weaker. Investigators tried to track the Jeep through its plates and registration, but got nowhere. The only thing they could say for sure was that the vehicle didn't belong to anyone who lived in the building. Detectives started talking to Kendra's friends and family, trying to figure out if she'd had any conflicts with anyone. She'd only been living in Dallas for about 6 months, so her circle there wasn't very big yet, but she had already made a few close friends. All of them said the same thing. Kendra didn't have enemies, and there hadn't been any drama in her life. At work, it was no different. Her colleagues said every parent was happy with her, and that Kendra was amazing with kids. With no real suspect to focus on, police decided to release images of the black Jeep to the media and ask the public to help identify the driver. The next day, toward evening, detectives got a call from a man named Joe. He told them the vehicle in the footage was definitely his, but he hadn't been the one driving it. According to Joe, on the day of the murder, his childhood friend, a woman named Brenda, had reached out to him. He owned an auto shop, and she asked if he could take a look at her friend's car, a woman named Crystal. Brenda and Crystal came by the shop, dropped off the car, and asked Joe if he could lend them something to drive while he worked on it. Joe handed them the keys to his black Jeep, and the two women drove off. That same evening, Joe went to a cafe where he and Brenda had agreed to meet so she could return the Jeep. But when she showed up, Crystal wasn't with her, and neither was the car. Brenda said her friend had gone off to run some errands but would be there soon. They sat in the cafe for quite a while, and the whole time, Brenda kept trying to call Crystal, but she never picked up. Then, Brenda said maybe her phone was acting up and asked to use Joe's. As soon as she dialed Crystal's number from his phone, Crystal answered right away and said she'd bring the Jeep over to Joe's house. A little later, they met there just like she'd promised. Crystal showed up with her young son, handed the car back, and she and Brenda drove off. Everything seemed normal. The next day, after Joe had already stopped thinking about the whole thing, he saw a news report about Kendra's murder and froze when he realized the police were looking for his Jeep. From the CCTV footage, it was obvious. That wasn't just the same model. It was his car. Joe met up with Brenda and told her he'd seen his Jeep on the news in connection with the killing, demanding an explanation. At first, she tried to convince him it was some other vehicle, but Joe was absolutely sure it was his. That's when she said Crystal had been the one driving and claimed she had no idea where her friend had gone or whether she had anything to do with what happened. Brenda added that Crystal regularly used drugs and that day had probably taken his Jeep to pick some up. She also told him not to contact Crystal or the police, warning it would only cause serious trouble for him. On top of that, She advised him to hide the Jeep, or better yet, repaint it. Joe knew his car had been involved in a murder and was in shock over the whole situation, so at first he didn't go to the police. He was scared he might end up in legal trouble himself. But the next day, he made up his mind and called 911. As soon as detectives got that information, they called Ricky and asked if he knew of any connection between Kendra, Brenda, and Crystal. To their surprise, Ricky said Kendra didn't know either of them, but he knew Brenda very well. She was his ex. And at that exact moment, while he was on the phone with detectives, Brenda was actually on her way over to his place. He and Brenda had met 3 years earlier, in 2012. She was 31 at the time, working as a dental assistant and studying to become a dentist herself. After a while, they moved in together and started talking about getting married. But over time, Ricky felt less and less happy in the relationship. And by August 2014, 2 years after they met, he decided to break up with her. For Brenda, it was a heavy blow. She didn't want to let him go, and even took a break from school because she couldn't think about anything except their relationship. Still, she moved out and got an apartment in a nearby neighborhood. She also kept in close contact with Ricky, and he continued to help her out since her salary barely covered rent. Sometimes he paid for her groceries and bills, and he even added her phone line to his own plan. Ricky had no intention of getting back together with her though, and was actively trying to meet someone new. He just couldn't seem to find the right person. About 2 months after the breakup, Ricky decided to sign up for a dance class, and to his surprise, Brenda was there too. They got paired up, started talking again, and eventually, Ricky decided to give the relationship a second chance. But 6 months later, he ended up right back where he'd been before. He felt that they just weren't a good match. And this time, the breakup was final. Just like the first time, Brenda took it hard. But Ricky had no intention of getting back together and tried to keep contact to a minimum. That turned out to be easier said than done. He kept running into her all over the city. At first, he brushed it off. She lived not too far from him, so it didn't seem that strange. But after a while, it started to feel off. Wherever he went, Brenda somehow seemed to be there too. Later, Ricky met Kendra, and Brenda faded into the background for him. She was still on his phone plan though, and he'd text her every so often, asking her to switch to her own plan because he was still paying for it. Each time, Brenda talked him into waiting a little longer. Eventually, he decided to cut it off himself and messaged her that he was going to shut her line down in early September, right around the time he and Kendra were planning their trip to Mexico. Now that police had told Ricky Brenda might have been involved in the murder, he was in a panic. After Kendra's death, he told all his friends and people close to him what had happened, including Brenda. She replied only the next day, offered her condolences, and asked how she could help. She even promised to bring him groceries, and at the exact moment detectives called him, Ricky was at home waiting for her to show up. Officers quickly tracked Brenda down at a library where she was studying for an exam and brought her to the station for questioning. At the same time, detectives also located Crystal and questioned her separately. Brenda answered everything extremely carefully, as if she were afraid to give even a little more information than necessary. She said she spent several hours at the library the day before, studying for dental school exams, and then went to a cafe for about an hour. She even put out the receipt to prove it. Detectives realized she'd been at the cafe right during the window when Kendra was killed, which meant Brenda had a rock-solid alibi. Still, they weren't buying her story completely for a few reasons. Brenda couldn't remember the full timeline of her day, what time she'd woken up, how she'd gotten to the library or back home, or what she'd done with the rest of her time. But the cafe receipt, the one that covered the exact time of the murder, she produced instantly. It was sitting right on top inside her wallet, in almost perfect condition. Detectives got the feeling she'd been keeping it ready, knowing she might have to show it to the police. And that wasn't all. When they checked her alibi, it held up. She really had been at the cafe, and physically, she couldn't have been the one to shoot Kendra. But now that both Brenda and Crystal were at the station, detectives took another look at the security footage and realized something important. The woman behind the wheel of the Jeep looked a lot more like Crystal than Brenda. While one group of detectives was talking to Brenda, their colleagues were questioning Crystal. And that interview went a lot further. At first, Crystal insisted she didn't know anything and had nothing to do with what happened. But once they showed her the surveillance footage, she changed her story and admitted she was the one driving the Jeep. Only, she said, things hadn't happened the way the police thought. According to her, she was just driving around town with her young son when a man with a gun suddenly jumped into the car and told her to do exactly what he said. He supposedly ordered her to pull into the parking garage of an apartment building, got out of the car, and disappeared from view. A few seconds later, Crystal said she heard a gunshot. Then the man came back, got in, and told her to drive away. Detectives knew this didn't line up with reality at all. First, the surveillance footage clearly showed there was no child in the car. Second, they asked the obvious question: if this man got out and disappeared, why did you just sit there and wait instead of driving off? After that, Crystal changed her story again. This time, she said there had actually been a man with her named Lamar, and that Brenda had paid him $500 to rob Kendra and steal her documents so she wouldn't be able to fly to Mexico with Ricky. But for some reason, he decided to kill her instead. Right after that, Crystal was arrested, but Brenda's situation was more complicated. Detectives spent hours trying to get her to crack or admit to anything at all, and she kept calmly insisting she was innocent. In the end, they had to let her go. There wasn't a single piece of hard evidence tying her to the crime, and they couldn't just hold her indefinitely. As for Lamar, Crystal claimed she'd never met him before that night and had no idea how to find him. Detectives went through her phone and didn't see anyone under that name, but one contact did stand out: Christopher Love. In the days leading up to the murder, Crystal had called him several times, including shortly before and immediately after Kendra was killed. Police got his address, secured a search warrant, and found a handgun in his home that matched the caliber used in the shooting. On his phone, they also found a photo taken the day after the murder, showing him holding $500 in cash. When ballistics came back, experts confirmed it was the gun that killed Kendra. Christopher was arrested on the spot and at first denied having anything to do with it. When detectives laid out the evidence, he admitted he'd been in the parking garage, but claimed Crystal was the one who pulled the trigger. They kept pressing, asking why, if that were true, the murder weapon was in his house and not hers. After a total of about 20 hours of questioning, he finally told them what really happened. The plan from the beginning had been to kill Kendra. Brenda was behind it, Crystal was the driver, and he was the one who fired the shot. With two people now pointing the finger at Brenda, detectives finally had enough to arrest her. But they were in for a nasty surprise. They found out she'd fled to Mexico, and no one seemed to know exactly where she was hiding. The FBI put her on their list of most wanted women, and Mexican authorities joined the hunt. Even so, Brenda managed to stay off the radar for months. It wasn't until about half a year later that police finally found her lying low at a relative's house. She barely went outside and spoke only to family, which is why it took so long to track her down. Catching her, however, created a new problem for the U.S. prosecutor. He fully intended to seek the death penalty, but Mexico would only agree to extradite her if the United States promised not to pursue a death sentence. That left him with two options: walk away and let Brenda live her life in Mexico, or give up the death penalty and go for life in prison instead. It wasn't a hard choice. He agreed to drop the death penalty, and Brenda was extradited back to the United States. By the time Brenda was back in the U.S., a lot had changed. Detectives had spent months building the case, and the pile of evidence they'd put together painted a genuinely disturbing picture. Crystal, who'd been sitting in jail this whole time, agreed to a plea deal: 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. In exchange, she started talking. She said she was broke and desperate, so when Brenda offered her $500 to help with the plan, she agreed. As for Christopher, Brenda told him she had powerful connections to a major cartel and that if he helped her get rid of Kendra, there would be big money and a huge supply of drugs waiting for him. According to Crystal, Brenda was completely obsessed with Ricky. After he broke up with her, she couldn't think about anything else and spent almost all her time tracking him. She'd gotten access to his iCloud, which meant she could basically see everything he did on his phone. On top of that, She got into his email and even added his phone to a Find My iPhone app so she could see his location at any time. That's why Ricky kept bumping into her all over town. Brenda knew exactly where he was, almost every minute of the day. She also read all of his messages, including the ones with Kendra, and she could see their relationship moving fast. Watching Ricky fall in love with someone else was something she just couldn't accept. About 6 months before the murder, Brenda started putting together a plan to get rid of Ricky's new girlfriend and walk away without police ever looking in her direction. At one point, she tried to talk one of her friends into helping. The idea was to inject Kendra with a concentrated dose of some kind of drug and hit Ricky in the head hard enough to put him in a coma. Brenda was furious that he'd chosen someone else, but she still didn't want him dead, just out of the picture. That friend later told police she'd actually considered it for a while because Brenda offered her $2,000 and drugs, but in the end, she backed out. Later, through that same woman, Brenda met her friend Crystal and quickly earned her trust. Over the next few months, Brenda talked about almost nothing but Ricky and his new girlfriend. She saved every photo of them from social media, studied the routes of their trips, and read all of their messages. From there, the conversations turned darker. The two women started discussing how they could get rid of Kendra, and Brenda kept throwing out ideas, from poisoning her to staging some kind of tragic accident. Then, they decided they needed a third person, someone who would actually pull the trigger. So they went walking around Crystal's neighborhood, which was known for being pretty rough, and that's where they ran into a local drug dealer named Christopher. He quickly agreed to take the job in exchange for cash and drugs, and even said he already had a gun. After that, they spent a long time following Kendra, learning her routes inside and out. Eventually, Brenda decided the best place to kill her would be the multi-level parking garage at Kendra's building. They started sneaking in by tailing residents' cars as they drove through the gate, using their entry code. They memorized where Kendra usually parked and even talked about putting a tracker on her car in case she picked a different spot. Finally, they chose a day and set the plan in motion. Brenda went to one friend and asked to borrow his car, saying hers had broken down. He agreed, and Crystal and Christopher set out to do the job. But they quickly realized the car had some kind of mechanical issue and got spooked that it might ruin everything. Brenda returned that car to her friend and then turned to someone else. Joe, the same Joe who later came forward to the police. He lent her his black Jeep. Crystal got behind the wheel. Christopher hid in the back seat, and Brenda got out near the library so she'd have an alibi. Crystal and Christopher drove over to the clinic where Kendra worked and waited for her to head home. But she was running late, which wasn't part of the plan. Eventually, Crystal left the area, dropped Christopher off near her neighborhood, picked up her son from school, took him to her parents' place, then came back for Christopher. And together, they returned to Kendra's clinic. Before that, they'd put fake plates on the Jeep so it couldn't be traced. When Kendra finally pulled out of the parking lot, they followed her, but quickly lost her car in traffic. So, they headed straight to her building instead, waited for a resident to drive into the garage, and slipped in right behind them. Once inside, they found a spot to hide and lay in wait for Kendra. While they were waiting, Christopher wiped down the gun in every single round, then put on gloves. As soon as Kendra drove into the garage, parked in her usual spot, and stepped out of her car, Christopher ran up to her and fired a single shot at almost point-blank range. After that, he jumped back into the Jeep and Crystal tried to get out of the garage. At first, she accidentally drove down, thinking there was an exit there, only to hit a dead end. She turned around, made it out, and headed to a nearby town, where they wanted to get rid of Kendra's purse. Christopher had taken it so the whole thing would look like a robbery, another one of Brenda's ideas. When they got back to Dallas, they waited for Brenda's call. At that moment, she was sitting in a cafe with Joe, pretending she was trying to reach Crystal, but in reality, she was just stalling for time. Eventually, she dialed Crystal's number from Joe's phone, and her friend confirmed the job was done. After that, they returned the Jeep to its owner, then drove to Crystal's parents' house and burned Kendra's things in the backyard. It turned out they'd gone to that other town for nothing, failing to find a good place to dump the evidence. Afterward, Brenda paid them and said that if the police ever got close, she planned to run to Mexico. And while she was still off the detective's radar, she didn't miss the chance to comfort Ricky. She brought him groceries and acted like she was just a caring friend, looking after him in the middle of his grief. In the end, prosecutors had more than enough evidence on all three people involved, and the case moved to trial. First up was Christopher. In 2018, for his role in the murder, he was sentenced to death. Next came Crystal. She received the agreed-upon sentence from her plea deal, 35 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. And finally, in the summer of 2019, it was Brenda's turn, the woman who had put the whole plan together. Prosecutors told the jury she was driven by jealousy and an obsession on a truly terrifying scale, and that if it weren't for the conditions of her extradition from Mexico, she almost certainly would have been given the death penalty. The jury needed just 20 minutes to reach a verdict, an incredibly short time in a case like this. Brenda was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial, she showed no sign of remorse and never apologized to Kendra's family, though they didn't expect her to. Right now, all three are still behind bars. In February 2025, there was talk that a judge might finally set an execution date for Christopher, but so far, that hasn't happened. So, this complicated case eventually came to a close, but it left a permanent mark on everyone involved because of how senselessly cruel it was. Even if you set aside the fact that Brenda was willing to have another woman killed simply because she'd fallen in love with her ex, there are still Christopher and Crystal, people who agreed to help carry out that plan for a few $100s with zero regard for someone else's life. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.